welcome to the 17th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee. Agenda item 1 today is to decide whether to take items 4 and 5 in private. Does everyone agree to do so? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation and its consideration of a negative instrument of subordinate legislation, the Glasgow Caledonian University Amendment Order of Council 2020 SSI 2020/172. Do any members wish to comment on this instrument? Oh, thank you. We now move to agenda item 3, which is our main item of business this morning, an evidence session on the SQA results for 2020. Can I welcome to committee Fiona Robertson, Chief Executive, and Dr Gill Stewart, Director of Qualifications at the Scottish Qualification Authorities. We're very tight for time this morning, but I would like to invite Fiona Robertson to make a brief opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to make an opening statement, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the 2020 results published last Tuesday. Given the unprecedented nature of this year's process and the impact it has on the lives of many thousands of people young people across Scotland, I'm very pleased to appear before you this morning to give you more detail and to answer any questions the committee may have. Everyone at SQA is keenly aware of the strength of feeling about last week's results, particularly from young people. I have heard some of those concerns directly. The committee will, of course, want to discuss what we did and why. I hope my opening statement and answers today provides the clarification you will be seeking. As you know, exams in Scotland have been held every spring since 1888, and on the 19th of March, the Deputy First Minister announced the closure of schools and the cancellation of exams in response to COVID-19. At the same time, he commissioned SQA to develop an alternative certification model for 2020 to ensure that the hard work of young people across Scotland is fully recognised through our qualifications system, as it would be in any year. Maintaining standards over time was a key element of that and was central to the approach that we took. Indeed, since the outset, our approach in good faith has been based on 3 core principles which reflect both how we work and the circumstances of 2020. Fairness to all learners, safe and secure certification of our qualifications whilst following the latest public health advice, and maintaining the integrity and credibility of our qualifications system, ensuring that standards are maintained over time in the interests of learners. On 20th of April, we set out 4 key stages to our approach: estimates, awarding, results and certification, and appeals. And I'd like to talk through each element briefly, and I think it's important to do so. The key input to our alternative certification model has been based on estimated grades. Research tells us that schools and college estimates are not always accurate. Estimating accuracy varies across centres, subjects and courses. We receive estimates every year from schools and colleges, and in 2019, using matched data at candidate level, which is important, 48% of grades estimated at National 5 resulted at those grades. At higher, 44%, and at advanced higher, 43%. This is an important part of the case for moderation of grades. We knew that evidence of the accuracy of teacher estimates was below 50%, and given the commission from ministers, we had a responsibility to consider the moderation of teacher estimates where appropriate, and I made that clear to the committee on the 1st of May. However, given the importance of the estimates this year, we made considerable efforts to assist teachers with estimation. Detailed guidance and an online course were provided to schools and colleges on the 20th of April, and we also provided schools and colleges with additional data, including estimation over a number of years, so that they could look at that data. On the 4th of August, SQA accepted almost 3/4 of teacher and lecturer estimates, and 99% of awards were awarded at or within 1 grade of the estimate. I will say more about that in a moment. But what I will say now is that there could have been no certification of any nature this year without these estimates, and we owe schools and colleges our sincere thanks. We treated those estimates with the utmost respect. Professional judgment for assessment is at the heart of Scottish education. Every year, effective judgments take place in schools and colleges and are supported, validated and enhanced through moderation. This year, in the absence of external assessment, moderation was a key part of our approach, both within schools and colleges, using a range of data and discussion, and of course nationally by SQA. On the 29th of May, we received estimates from schools and colleges across Scotland representing 511,070 entries across 129 subjects and 467 centres. At a national level, estimates we received were above previous A to C attainment at National 5, at higher and at advanced higher. Attainment rates do, of course, vary between subjects and over time, but estimated A to C attainment rates were 10.4 percentage points higher at National 5, 14 percentage points higher at higher, and 13.4 percentage points higher at advanced higher than results in the previous year. The level of estimation at grade A contributed most to those higher A to C estimated grades, particularly at higher and advanced higher. On the basis of the commission we received from the Scottish Government, there was a clear and unequivocal case for some moderation. My colleague Jill Stewart can say a little more about the detail of that process if the committee wishes. Full details of our awarding process are provided in a range of documents that were published last week, including our methodology report. We also published 129 reports relating to each course. What I will say, however, is this. Starting point distributions were constructed for each course, setting out the parameters for each grade and at A to C, with tolerances around the mean to allow some variability in attainment this year. This included the input of teachers, our principal assessors and subject specialists to ensure integrity. Historic attainment did form part of the process at centre level. If you accept the premise of moderation, it had to. But we did acknowledge the volatility of a centre's attainment over time, and we made additional allowances for that. It was not defined purely on the basis of past performance. And finally, every school and college was in scope for moderation, and all were treated in the same way. We did not know the name or location of the centre when it was being moderated, and that's an important part of demonstrating fairness and consistency of our approach. Schools and colleges were not seen as postcodes at all. We said we would consider entering into a dialogue with schools and colleges about their estimates to explore the reasons why they were higher or lower than before, and we did consider this. I can understand why the committee and others may have seen this as a sensible step. Time constraints were an issue, but crucially, we were not confident that this could be done fairly and consistently. This needed to be evidence-based, and we designed an appeals process to be evidence-based. We always acknowledged that the extraordinary circumstances of this year could lead to a number of anomalies in the results, and there were. I have received very reasonable and considered correspondence from schools which has highlighted that. And the last part of our four-stage process, the appeals process, was a very important stage in our processes. It would have provided for further evidence-based review of individual candidate work if schools and colleges did not think awarded grades fairly reflected candidate performance. I can assure the committee that we were ready for a higher volume of appeals this year. There has been misreporting of that, which has not served disappointed young people well. The committee was right to press me on our responsibilities in relation to equalities, but our commitment to that was never in doubt. Throughout the development of the model, we had equalities at the heart of our thinking and developed and refined an equalities impact assessment and a child rights and wellbeing impact assessment to inform our approaches and decisions, as well as to demonstrate our compliance with our statutory obligations. In terms of process, our guidance to centres on equalities in the estimation process assisted them in fulfilling their equalities responsibilities. Our post-certification review and exceptional consideration arrangements were also designed to address any cases of discrimination or bias in original estimates by centres. Our statistical analysis of available data from 2006 onwards demonstrates that after moderation, learners in the most deprived SIND bandings saw attainment levels for A to C higher than both 2019 results and the average result for 2016 to 19. as well as narrowing of the attainment gap between those in the most deprived and least deprived SIMD bandings over the same period. It is outcomes and achievements that matter. I have already highlighted in broad terms the moderation outcomes, though it is important to underline again the value we placed on teacher estimates. Nearly 75% of estimates were accepted. 99% of entries were awarded at or within one grade of the estimates. A to C attainment in 2020 using the alternative certification model was as follows: National 5, 81% compared to 78.2% in 2019. Higher, 78.9% compared to 74.8% in 2019. And Advanced Higher, 84.9% compared with 79.4% in 2019. To conclude, on the approach we took, we were commissioned by ministers to develop an alternative certification model to maintain standards over time, and we did that in good faith. On the basis of the commission, SQA felt there was a clear and unequivocal case for moderation, and we developed an approach to do that. An enhanced, individualised and evidence-based appeals service was developed as the final stage, recognising the exceptional and unique circumstances of this year. However, I would acknowledge that while we can congratulate many thousands of young people who achieved a strong result last week, in line with our expectations, the system also meant some people did not receive awards they felt they were capable of achieving. Joy and disappointment are a feature of Results Day every year. But this year, disappointment was compounded by the cancellation of exams. Young people did not have the opportunity to demonstrate what they could achieve, and moderation felt very impersonal to them. I have just a final comment on the latest developments of yesterday, if I may. Okay. Yesterday, the Deputy First Minister outlined in a statement to Parliament that he was using powers available to him under the Education Scotland Act 1996 to direct SQA to change the previous approach to certification this year, and instead award candidate results based solely on the estimates provided by schools and colleges. As you know, the moderation process was symmetric, and we moderated up around 9,000 entries, and these awards will stand. It is the prerogative of ministers to issue a direction of this kind. It is our responsibility to fully comply. I'm pleased to say that schools and colleges already have the estimates information that will form the basis of the amended results, but we will work to ensure that centres receive their confirmed results as soon as possible, and no later than the end of next week. Any candidate whose grade changed as a result will receive a new certificate, and we will publish final headline results on Friday the 21st of August. We will also share confirmed results with UCAS. We are considering in more detail with the Scottish Government any appeals process which should support this direction, and will announce further details shortly. We will of course cooperate fully and positively with the review of the alternative certification model for National Qualifications 2020 and the OECD review. With regards to 2021, we will shortly be announcing a consultation exercise on options for arrangements for qualifications in the 2020 to 21 session. Our focus there will be to assist the system in what could be a difficult year ahead. To conclude, SQA delivered on the Scottish Government's initial request, and we believe we moderated grades judiciously to maintain standards over time and ensure the credibility of qualifications for the benefit of learners. Through our equality impact assessment, we demonstrated that the process produced fair outcomes. An individual evidence-based appeals process was in place to deal with any issues. Ministers have reflected on the results in this extraordinary year and have asked us to deliver a change to the process. As Chief Executive of the SQA, I can assure the committee that we are an organisation that above all else is committed to delivering for learners. We are also an organisation of integrity and seek to undertake our work to the highest professional standards. We worked very hard this year to deliver, and I can assure you that any criticism of the last week has been felt most keenly by me and my colleagues that I have the privilege to work alongside. As Chief Examiner, I have the responsibility also to this year's learners who are entered for our qualifications, but also the learners of the past and the future. So the focus on maintaining standards of our qualifications over time and between schools felt not only right but essential. But the ask in this extraordinary year, has changed. Given that change, we will meet our responsibilities and we will deliver on those responsibilities. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee this morning, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Okay. Thank you. And I urge again, please, brevity in questions and answers would be really helpful, because there's a lot of areas to cover and a lot of members wanting to come in. And can I invite our Deputy Convener, Daniel Johnson, to open
Thank you, Convener. Can I begin by saying I think it's unfortunate that you've opened taking 15 minutes when what is largely a defence of the decision that has just been overturned. I think what we need is a reflection of what's happened and what needs to be altered in future arrangements. So let me begin by, I think, the key reflection that there needs to take place. Your defence of the methodology has largely been based on the aggregate outcomes of results. But the issue is the impact that there was on individual schools at a micro level. So let me give you an example from my constituency. Perhaps the most improved school in the city over the last 5 years has been one in my city, but it was also the school that was the worst impacted, with 76% of high results downgraded. If we take maths as a particular subject area, over the last 4 years, they have consistently shown a 3% increase in attainment. This year's cohort outperformed last year's cohort in National 5, but despite that, not only did they do worse at higher maths than last year, they received the second worst set of results for maths in that school in the last 5 years. And that surely demonstrates the problem that when you take a mean average of attainment over the last 5 years and apply that in essentially predicting the results of that cohort, that essentially completely removes that ability to take into account attainment or improving attainment levels from a centre. So, can I ask you to reflect, is that a critical issue in the methodology you deployed? But most importantly, did you test your methodology? Did you identify that as being a problem? Did you look at the range of downgrading? Because while the headline is around a quarter, to have any centre with a 76% of grades being downgraded, surely that should have rung alarm bells.
So there are a number of issues there, and I'll seek to address them, and I'll also bring in Jill Stewart just to talk a little bit more about the centre level moderation. You're absolutely right in saying that the national position in relation to estimates is not the full story, because every school and college across Scotland also provided estimates as part of that, and those estimates can varied considerably between and across schools and between and across subjects. So what we're seeking to do was to bring in a moderation process that recognised that, and that moderation, crucially, was a function of the estimates that we'd received. And for the most part, attainment in schools across Scotland went up this year. As I highlighted in my opening statement, attainment actually increased. There are some subjects in some schools that have shown anomalous results, and we are in discussions with, we've had discussions with those schools, and the intention was that they would be considered as part of our appeals process. But they are relatively small in number. And I think we recognised that in the extraordinary circumstances of this year and the task that we were asked to undertake, that it was important that that safety net was put in place. As far as the methodology around centre level, what we've called centre level moderation, we were looking at the historic attainment. We were looking at the historic attainment by course in each school. And as I highlighted again in my opening statement, we looked to ensure that there was an element of relative flexibility, so a tolerance at either end of that range of historic attainment, and what we were seeking to do, but with some flexibility, was to ensure in broad terms that awards reflected that historic attainment, but as I say, with some flexibility. Joe, do you want to add any more in terms of the centre level moderation? But I think it's very important to highlight that as well as looking at the national position, it was really important that we understood and reflected on what centres were telling us, because I've got I have a responsibility not only to this year's young people and young people across years, but we also have a responsibility to ensure that the standard of an A in the school that you're describing is also
but
the standard
we've got a
of an A.
limited number of questions this morning, so I just hope if we could maybe move on to my next question. But from that, I didn't hear that you had tested that or looked at outliers. And again, you've insisted that it's a historic mean that you looked at. But moving on from that, when you look at the process that you set out in your document, essentially that confirmed what you're confirming this morning, that essentially that you looked at that statistical range of results and applied that. However, when you appeared before us on the 1st of May, you said that moderation, and I'm quoting, and indeed you were quoting at the time, the information that you provided on the 20th April, that we will use the information from these estimates in addition to prior learner attainment where this is available. For example, if learners achieved National 5 or higher courses in the previous year. We will also look at schools and colleges' previous history of estimating and attainment. But those were not features that appeared in your methodology. That did not happen. So what you stated would happen in terms of moderation was not what happened. And critically, in only using that historical average attainment by centre, did you not ultimately break the link between individual learner performance and the grade that they finally received? Because it was not based on that at all. It was purely based on whether or not that predicted grade was in line with the historical mean. You did not check whether or not there was justification of applying that estimate. You just rounded it down if it fell outside that average that you had arrived at in your statistical process. Is that not correct?
It's not correct. Prior attainment did form a feature of the work that we did in setting the starting point distributions from each course. The difficulty that we have in Scotland in what we have an integrated senior phase, and we obviously have no prior attainment data for National 5, and this is set out in our methodology report. We have no attainment data, prior attainment data at National 5. For higher, we have partial prior attainment data. So a number of young people, and indeed a number of schools, do not undertake National 5s at all. They will go straight to higher. And of course, and in addition, a number of young people will do a crash higher in a subject, so we'll have no prior attainment. So it's an imperfect data set. And it was on that basis that we could not include it in the model, the final model, because it was incomplete and therefore could not be applied consistently. Because the fact of the matter is that young people in Scotland do not always have, even at quite high levels of qualifications, do not always have a lower level of qualification there. And in terms of previous estimates of attainment, I think what we sought to do this year was to try and ensure that the estimates from schools and colleges were as good as they could be, and so so effectively, I think we effectively broke the previous relationship to an extent, and I think it's evident in the figures. We've gone from an average of, 45% of grades. On the basis of our moderation approach, we accepted 75% this year. So estimating behaviour by schools was a little different this year. It was actually, we thought it was more accurate because we accepted 75% when we knew that last year it was less than 50%. So I think there are reasons for the approach that we took, and I hope you understand the point around prior attainment. We did not have that individualised prior attainment for young people across our qualifications.
Well, I just made a final comment. You said that I was not correct in my assessment, but then gave an explanation which seemed to reinforce it. But I'll move on.
I think I highlighted, just to be clear, that prior attainment was part of our methodology. So I think that was why I gave you the answer that I did.
Just to add one other point, We did test out our methodology on a number of occasions, and there are 22,000 combinations of course and centre combinations, so we could not possibly look at every single one of those. But what we did do was, for each refinement of our model, we looked at the impact at a national level, but we also looked at the impact upon every single course, and we also sampled impacts upon individual centres. But we could not look at the impact upon every single centre for every single course that they were on offer, because we had a relatively short period of time.
Okay, I'm going to bring in remotely Jamie Green, followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, committee, and good morning to our guests. I think I appreciate that this has been an extraordinarily difficult year for everyone in the education sector, not least for those who work in the front line of it. And given that today's back to school, I think it's important that we pay credit to those, especially those teachers who worked hard under the instructions of ministers and the agencies. I just want to get to the crux of this. I listened with intent to your opening statement, respectfully, but there's one word I didn't hear anywhere in that, and that's the word sorry. And I say that because the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister apologised this week for the handling of this year's award. And yesterday, the Deputy First Minister pretty much overturned everything that you and your agency have been doing for these past 4 months. Let me ask, what do you say to him today? And what do you say to the young people that he had to apologise to?
I think what my opening statement sought to do was to seek to explain what we had done and the basis on the basis for that. I mean, of course, you know, it was difficult to see that. Of course, it was very difficult to see the reaction to last week's results, and but we were asked to fulfil a role, and part of that role was to maintain standards across Scotland. And while I absolutely fully understand the feelings of young people and the strength of those feelings, it was important, and I think the Deputy First Minister reflected that in his statement to Parliament, that I explain the basis on which we undertook that work. It was a commission from ministers after exams had been cancelled, and in an extraordinary set of circumstances that I think we would all acknowledge. And I think we did our very best to deliver. And I also fully appreciate that, as I highlighted in my opening statement, that young people felt that their achievements had been taken out with their control. So I absolutely get that, and of course I regret how young people have felt about this process. However, I think it's also important to highlight that, you know, I've had messages from many young people over the last week saying how pleased they are with the outcome, and so I think it's absolutely important to temper quite clearly the strong feelings from young people across Scotland who feel that they've been unfairly treated, with the delight from others who feel they have got awards that reflect their achievements. But absolutely regret the circumstances of the last week. But I think it's important that the committee, and indeed anyone watching the committee, understands the basis on which we undertook the work on a commission from government and did our very best to fulfil it.
It's also important to remember the last stage in the process, which is the appeals process to identify.
Mr Green, I think Dr Stewart wants to come in. If you just give it a few seconds, thanks.
Yeah, just a brief point, Convener. It was just to say that it's important to remember that the alternative certification model had 4 steps, including the appeals process, which was put in place so that any issues that resulted from the model that SQA had applied could be addressed through schools and colleges submitting appeals for individuals or groups of candidates with evidence, and that would be looked at by teachers who work with us to do that and who were trained to do that. So that was always the intent, that the process included that last step to allow any issues with the results to be addressed through that process. But we didn't get to the stage, obviously, of implementing that stage of the alternative certification model.
But that, I mean, that was, and I apologise for interrupting. There's a short delay, but I mean, doesn't that get to the nub of this? Given that the appeals process was a fundamental part of that process that no longer exists. That's all been thrown out of the window by the ministers. So can I ask, and I think there's still some confusion over this, who made the decision to apply the methodology that saw the downgrading of those in our most deprived communities downgraded at a much higher rate, almost double, than those in our least deprived? At what point did somebody flag that and say, that doesn't look right, that doesn't feel right? Who signed off this methodology? Was it the SQA? Was it the Education Secretary? Or was it the Chief Executive?
I think it's important to remember that all of the data was anonymised during this moderation process. So, you know, we did not know which centre or which candidate. So it was all anonymised to avoid any bias that might emerge through the methodology. And then at the end of the process, we did do the analysis working with the Scottish Government to look at the impact on the data that we held and they held around SIMD, age, and also sex. So we did do that analysis at the end, but during the process, it was completely anonymised, so there was no opportunities for any bias about particular schools.
Pat, I think your substantive point, Mr. Green, is around who was responsible for the methodology. The broader point around that, and we can talk a little bit more. I'm sure that the issues around equalities will come up during the course of this session, and and ensuring that we fulfilled our responsibilities and made sure that before we concluded the process, that we made sure that we had fulfilled our equality duties as an organisation, and for all the right reasons. But I think, as the Deputy First Minister said yesterday, the SQA is an executive NDPB. Members of the committee will be familiar with what that means. I report to a board which is appointed by ministers, and that is the link between the organisation and ministers. Under normal circumstances, and I appreciate the announcement yesterday was not under normal circumstances, and the direction given was not under normal circumstances. But in a normal year, it is for SQA to discharge its functions, its statutory functions in awarding qualifications in Scotland. And this year, despite the extraordinary nature of this year, that was no different. We were given a commission by the Deputy First Minister on the 19th of March, when he had announced school closures and the cancellation of exams, which is was his prerogative and obviously understandable in the circumstances. And it was our responsibility to fulfil that function. So the methodology was the responsibility of the SQA, and the methodology was also, as you would expect, considered by the SQA board, which in turn is accountable to ministers. So it's important that I set out that broad piece, and as the Deputy First Minister said yesterday in Parliament, I provided a briefing to him on the 30th of July, and that would be quite a standard feature of the system around pre-release of the attainment statistics, to set out the approach that we had taken and the context and the detail of that approach.
You very helpfully explained the relationship between the agency and the ministers. I get that. That's not my question. My question is, who takes ultimate responsibility for the way that this year's exams were handled? Because the First Minister and the Education Secretary very publicly have absolved you and your agency of all responsibility for this. So I would say, if you're not to blame, who is?
Well, I think what I would say there is I suppose I'm repeating a point I've already made, which is we were asked to develop an alternative certification model to maintain standards and we believed we did that to the best of our ability, and that was our responsibility to do so. It was under a commission, a direction from ministers back in March. So while I understand what you're saying, I think that accountability relationship is quite important, and indeed that was brought into sharp focus yesterday with the announcement of a ministerial direction. But I think Mr Swinney also highlighted that we had undertaken and fulfilled our role as it was expressed back in March, and I think we've talked already about the circumstances which led to that change. But as Chief Examiner, I have responsibility for ensuring credibility and integrity of our qualifications, but crucially maintaining standards over time. So I genuinely believe it was a reasonable thing, and indeed I made it clear at committee, and that was obviously in advance of sight of the estimates. We hadn't received the estimates at that point, back on the 1st of May, that we needed to reserve the right to moderate. The reason for that was simple, actually, and it was on the basis that we knew that teacher estimates did not always result in the grade of the estimate. So it felt fair to candidates that we considered moderation, and there was no presumption. I think this is really important. There was no presumption that moderation would be down. Moderation was a symmetric process, and indeed we moderated around 9,000 entries up. So if estimates had come in low, we would have made that adjustment. So I think that's actually quite an important point. This wasn't about taking grades off young people. This was actually about achieving fairness, albeit in the extraordinary circumstances of this year. But as I say, I would acknowledge the strength of feeling as a result of the results that we published last Tuesday. Absolutely.
To Dr. Allen, followed by Ross Creer.
Thank you, Convener. There's obviously, as I don't need to tell you, been a great deal of debate in Scotland and indeed today in England about the wisdom of linking this methodology to the whole issue of past performance. You've indicated yourself that the SQA were responsible for that methodology. Even putting to one side the crucial issue of whether that was wise or not in itself, can I ask about the degree to which you felt that there was available appropriate data even to use that system? I'm thinking specifically of small subjects, by which I mean subjects on which any one school has very little evidence of having candidates in the past, and also small schools where the number of people taking any one higher in any one year, and I can think of some in my constituency might be 1 or 2 or 3 people.
Yeah. Yes, we highlight in our methodology report, and I think indeed I did last week also in my Chief Examining Officer's report, some of the challenges. There's no doubt about that. You're quite right to say that we have even at a national level for some subjects, quite small uptakes. We've got a lot. As you will know, Dr. Allen, we have a lot of we offer a lot of subjects across our curriculum, and even low uptake subjects we offer. And when you look at a school level, when you look at school level, school or college level, sometimes those are really quite small entries, small entry levels. But the centre level moderation did allow for that, in the sense that it didn't confine attainment this year to historic attainment. The methodology report also highlights that for centres or for schools or colleges that did not have a previous record of attainment, we accepted the estimates. And that related, I think, in my mind, to about 6,000 entries in total across a range of subjects. So if a centre was presenting a course for the first time, those estimates were accepted. And those estimates were accepted after moderation, so that it didn't affect any other part of the approach that we took.
In committee previously, you mentioned the SQA's view on how this methodology might be implemented. You said, I hope that this provides a bit of reassurance. The assertion that somehow we will fail a young person because of the school that they go to is an unfair one to make on the basis of what I have sought to say about the process that we're undertaking. Now, obviously, the accusation many young people have made is that the school they went to did play a part. But even putting that to one side, while I understand that there will be situations where people get 2 or 3 grades below or 2 or 3 grades above what they were expecting to get, did the system flag up, as we've heard about, many examples of situations where people did drop 2 or 3 grades and who either failed or from the point of view of university entrance effectively failed on the basis of the contentious algorithms that we're all talking about?
So I highlighted, and I have highlighted already, that we did, obviously the shape of the estimates resulted in moderation, which was largely down. So the shape of the estimates that came in and the attainment profile that came in absolutely highlighted that point. But it was done on the basis, as I've said, around a tolerance around historic attainment. And historic attainment, I understand, may feel contentious to the committee on the basis that it feels like a constraint and doesn't allow for variability. But I think what I need to give some assurance to the committee that the approach that we took allowed for that some flexibility. But of course, inevitably, on the basis that quite a lot of the increase in attainment was actually at A grade, there was a fall down from A to B, B to C, and so on. And the reason for that is that we maintained the rank order of teacher estimates. So we maintained the relative view of teachers and lecturers about their pupils. So we got rank order information for each band that we received. So I would acknowledge that as a result of moderation, and I made it clear in my Chief Examining Officer's report, a number of young people did move from A to C to DE, but the vast majority, in excess of 90% of those young people, were estimated at a C grade.
I suppose my question really is, if I may, convener, in that group of young people or people that we're talking about, who moved from an A to a C or who moved from a B to a D,
yes,
was the system that you were using sufficiently sensitive to identify those and flag them up as potential outliers? And were those individual cases followed up and investigated to find out whether the system you were using was robust?
Yeah, so we absolutely looked at, particularly in the early work that we were doing around the moderation process, we did look at what we call multi-grade changes as a result of moderation. And indeed, the approach that we took, without getting too technical about it, the approach that we took actually sought to minimise as far as possible those multi-grade changes. There were a relatively small number, as I highlighted at the start of my statement. 99% of entries were awarded at or within one band, or one grade of their estimate. So there was very, very little multi-grade movements. And there was some media reporting about young people moving from an A to an F. Well, we don't have an F grade in Scotland, and indeed, I think in some cases, we certainly recommended last week to young people that they speak to their school about the estimate that they received, because in some cases, schools either had not shared the estimates with young people, or indeed young people were just unaware of the estimates that had been presented for them. So that kind of set of expectations and understanding has been quite an important part of this process. But I absolutely accept that if you were a young person last week expecting an A and you got a C from us in this year, that felt like a tough result, and I understand that.
Thank you, Convener.
Move to Mr Greer, followed by Gail Ross, please.
Thank you, Convener. Before I pursue a slightly separate line of question, just to continue with what Dr Allen was asking Ms Robertson, I mean, you will have received many of the same kind of correspondence that we have, but I want to pick out one particular example that I got and ask you how the methodology resulted in this. I was contacted by a parent whose child had a really exceptional aptitude for maths. He got 94% in his National 5 maths, 90% in the higher. He was working towards the advanced higher, and she believed he was predicted an A. Now, as you say, his teacher may have indeed estimated a B, and there would be questions to ask as to why. But whether it was an A or a B he was predicted by his teacher, he was assigned a D. And what I'm trying to figure out is, if the system you used, how it could result in that. Is it the case that because no pupil at his school for the last 3 or 4 years had managed to achieve an A in advanced higher maths, the methodology essentially made it impossible for him to get an A in advanced higher maths? Or am I misunderstanding the methodology?
So in the example that you provide, and obviously I don't have the background to that, but just taking that example at face value, obviously, it's a strong candidate at National 5 and at higher. I think it's important to highlight that, you know, an A at higher does not necessarily translate to an A at advanced higher, and I think that is important. And there's lots of reasons for that. Advanced higher in particular, attainment can be impacted by unconditional offers for university, for example. But I'm not making any judgment on the case that you cite. I think it is important to understand what the school estimated, because without that, it's quite difficult for me to be definitive about how it came about. Because certainly, quite a high number of young people who move from an A to a B, the teacher estimates were at A band 5, so they were at the lowest banding of an A.
Forgive me, this is useful, but just because we're constrained for time, the specific question I asked was, if it was the case that no pupil at his school for the previous few years had managed to achieve an A in advanced higher maths, was it ever possible under this methodology for him to be awarded an A?
Yes, it should be possible because of the tolerances that I highlighted to you. So it certainly is possible. It certainly was possible to have an attainment pattern in a school that was not fully reflected in historic attainment, and that actually was a really important part of this process. Now, I understand the committee may provide examples this morning where the assertion is that hasn't quite worked. I think it's important to highlight that I've also had correspondence where there have been some anomalies in particular courses in particular schools, and a number of factors come into play here. And again, I realise there's some technical detail around all of that. That can be partly the results can be partly impacted by the shape and nature of the estimates that the school has provided. They can partly be impacted by also the starting point distribution from the course, because effectively what we're doing is we're looking at all centres, and we were looking as part of the moderation to assess all centres across all courses and bring the results within the starting point distributions. Now, in some cases,
Ms Robertson, I'm really sorry to cut you off again, but I feel that we are slightly repeating the same ground here, and we do need to move on because we've got a lot to get through.
I appreciate that, and I hope you also appreciate that I'm seeking to do the best that I can to answer your questions, and there is a level of technical detail to some of this, which I hope it's important that I do try and seek to explain that.
And I accept that, and I get that it is hard to explain a complex system concisely and in a short space of time. Moving on to the construction of the system, though, my understanding is that the SQA had internal statistical capacity. The SQA has a permanent statistician or permanent statistical capacity within its staff. Were additional statisticians or other equivalent post holders brought in from either directly from the Scottish Government or externally to assist in the construction of this process? And if that's the case, how much did that cost?
So The short answer is yes. We did, as I highlighted, it's an extraordinary year. We are not normally doing awarding in this way, and we did require to undertake some further work, and additional resources were required. So we were able to second some statistician support from the Scottish Government. So yes, would be the answer to that. We did that. And we also secured the services of 2 external providers, which are detailed in the methodology report. I genuinely don't have the sums to hand, but I can certainly provide that to the committee as you wish. That's not a problem.
Thanks. And just very briefly to finish off, the SQA, so am I correct in saying that there was some kind of post of a permanent statistician within the SQA?
There are a number of statisticians in the SQA, so there's a small statistics team within the SQA.
Is it the case, and obviously can't go into any specific individual detail, but is it the case that during this process, some of, or at least one of your own statisticians resigned?
One of our statisticians, yes, I understand one of our statisticians did resign, absolutely, yes. And in any organisation of the size that I have, there will be people that join us and people that leave us throughout this process.
Staff turnover is normal, but did they resign because they were concerned about this process?
I'm not privy to the full details of that particular individual, and it probably wouldn't be appropriate for me to go into that. In fairness to them, actually, obviously people will leave an organisation for a number of different reasons.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I can move on, Convener.
Thank you. Can I have Gail Ross followed by Beatrice Wishart? Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I asked this question on behalf of several teachers that I have spoken to that have been in touch with me in the past week. And Fiona Robertson, I think you said in your opening remarks that around 9,000 pupils had had their marks revised upwards in the initial marking. Now, there'll be a lot of pupils out there who have had their marks downgraded that will be wondering why people have had their marks upgraded. So can you tell me what the methodology was for actually marking grades upwards of teacher estimates? And don't you think that the outcome of this will be, if they go on to be presented for hires or advanced hires that they are now not ready for, that's giving a whole group of young people false hope?
Okay. So on the specific question in relation to the 9,000 entries that we moderated up, I think there's an important part here about the moderation process. There was no presumption that grades would go up or down, or indeed stay the same. The moderation process had symmetry to it, so it was important that if we found that the estimates were such that we felt that grades could go up as a result, then they should. So that was an important part of the process, and indeed in the direction from ministers, and we confirmed yesterday that those obviously those upgrades would stand. So 9,000 entries went up. In terms of progression, is the point you're making one around progression, around the issue of progression from National 5 to higher and advanced higher? Is that the point that you're interested in, and how this set of results impacts on that? Well, to be honest, I think schools were always very cognizant of that in this particular year, obviously given the disruptions to schooling. And it's obviously really nice to see young people this morning going to school for the first time after so many months, that they will be making those curriculum decisions around progression from National 5 to higher to advanced higher in the normal way. So I think that's an important piece here, which which sits alongside the awards that they have this year. Those are discussions that quite rightly can take place within a school or college in the normal way.
But the point is, if a teacher has estimated either a B or a C grade, or whatever the grade is, it's irrelevant actually, and that pupil wasn't expecting a grade that was going to then lead them on to be presented for advanced higher, or indeed to college or university, and then suddenly the SQA deems that the teacher estimate is incorrect, they give that pupil a higher grade. That pupil then gets presented for higher or advanced higher, but they're not actually ready for that course because the pupil is going forward then with a false assumption against what the teacher has recommended them to go on for.
So are you suggesting that we don't, are we suggesting that in the awards that we now provide this year that we don't accept the higher grade?
No, that's not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm asking you why you would upgrade teacher estimates and then possibly have pupils go on to courses that they're not ready for.
Well, I think I'd go back to the point around why we undertook moderation. What we were seeking to do was to ensure that the standard of an A or a standard of a B in one school was, broadly speaking, the standard of an A or a standard of B in another. And of course, the estimates themselves were very pertinent to that. There's no doubt about that. They were very pertinent to that. But I think there were a number of courses, there were in a number of schools where we felt that there was legitimacy to moving candidates up. And I suppose the crucial point here is that decisions around subject choice and curriculum decisions, including young people moving, for example, from a National 5 to a higher or indeed advanced higher, would always take place within a school. But the reason that we moderated more broadly, I think I've highlighted today the case for moderation. What we were seeking to do was to ensure that there was that fairness across centres. Now, I fully appreciate that some members of the committee are contesting that, the premise of moderation. I accept that you're doing that, but that was the reason that we did it. And as part of that, it was important that we understood that estimates could go up through moderation as well as down. I think that was actually a very important part of what we were doing. There was no presumption that estimates could there was no presumption that estimates could only go one way, and I think that felt right. The symmetry of the process felt the right thing to do.
Okay, thanks. Last question, convener. You say that you wanted to have fairness across all centres, and I can absolutely see why you would want that. How can you get fairness across all centres if the results, as you say, were all anonymous?
I think the reason for that anonymity in the moderation process was that we were treating all centres fairly and consistently. So as part of this process, I think it was quite an important part of ensuring fairness as far as possible, that we were treating in principle all centres the same, that they were within scope, and we were looking at the data in the appropriate way. I think it would have been wrong to have made judgments about a school on the basis of its postcode or its location or its sector. So that felt like the responsible thing to do as part of this process.
So all you knew about centres was their past results. You had no idea where they were placed.
No, and I think that was an important part of this process, because if you take that argument through to its conclusion, it was actually quite important that we did not make a judgment about a school on the basis of anything other than the evidence that was presented to us, and indeed in any normal year where teachers are marking, for the most part, teachers will not know really very much about the script. And I think that's right. It's a central premise of what we do, that we're looking at the evidence actually quite robustly, but without, if you like, without fear or favour. And so that's quite an important element around all of this. Of course, all that said, towards the end of the process, as we were doing the analysis, we were undertaking the equalities impact assessment, and it was at that point that we obviously needed to have an understanding of the impact of this process, and that's what we did. So it was at that point that obviously the data was presented in a different way, and so that we could have a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms Ross. Can we move to Ms Wishart to be followed by Ian Gray?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. First of all, could I just pay tribute to the educationalists across Scotland, and especially our young people who have been at the heart of this process, and I think they have carried themselves remarkably well with dignity. Ms Robertson, you indicated that professional judgment of teachers was at the heart of the process each year, but some of the teachers have had their professional judgment questioned. They will be SQA markers. So is there a risk that teachers no longer have confidence in the SQA or want to take up SQA roles in the future?
I think there's a really important part of what we do every year, which is quality assurance. And albeit that this year was very different in many respects, the principle of quality assurance stands. So on that basis, it's really important, and teachers and those checks and balances, if you like, in the system are undertaken by teachers for teachers. So so we work with many thousands of teachers each year to do that work for us, and I think they understand that it's a very important feature of maintaining standards. So it was actually a pretty big ask for every teacher in Scotland, or every teacher and lecturer across Scotland, across all 467 centres, to estimate entirely consistently. I don't think, in many respects, I don't think the premise of quality assurance of those estimates, and I accept the points that have been made around the debate, if you like, about the method of quality assurance. But the principle of the principle of quality assurance, I don't think was lost in the system in thinking about what was the best way to do this. And I would also add that during the course of the final stages of this process, when we undertook national awarding meetings, to look at every single course, 129 courses, that we involved principal assessors in that process, and those grade distributions were signed off by them. So those teachers that you mention were still very much part of this process, and we engaged with teachers as part of this process, and I think they understood why we were doing what we were doing.
My question was around actually future confidence, but I shall move on to a question about communication to students and parents. There was certainly a feeling within across the piece that teacher estimates are what was going to be the outcome. Those were going to be, the expectations were that teacher estimates were what young people would be awarded. Do you think that the SQA could have done more in terms of communicating what the process was with our young people?
So, I mean, I think we spent a lot of time on communication. There's always a debate about whether we should have done more or different, and I absolutely, and we'll reflect on that. I mean, certainly in looking at the work that we did, the work that we've done since March, there's been quite a lot of engagement with teachers, with learners, with parents. We've tried to consider the communication channels that we have, the way in which we communicate. We've met with young people. We've brought young people onto our qualifications committee. So there's been quite a lot there. if the perception is that we haven't done enough, I have to take, I have to accept that, and I need to and reflect on that. But I think we tried, tried quite hard to keep the system informed. I put out, I think, about 20 different communications to the whole system during this period. So we were doing quite regular communications with the system on the things that we were doing and the guidance that we were providing, and that felt quite important to do. But I think there was absolutely some good material in there which was well received, and we got good feedback on. But we did as much as we could in the time that we had to communicate this approach, I think I would say.
Thank you, Convener. In the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you. We're actually a little ahead of where I was hoping at the moment, just to let people know that I will give a chance for others to come back in once every member has contributed. So Jamie Halco-Johnson to be followed by Alec Neil. Oh, sorry, Ian Gray. Sorry, Ian Gray to be followed by Jamie Halco-Johnson.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'd like to return to this point about the anonymised data, anonymisation of the centres, because it's a bit of a red herring, this, isn't it? Because I don't think anybody has suggested that the SQA looked at the exam results, looked at centres, identified them, said, oh, that's EH33, it's Trinent, we'll knock them down. Nobody's suggesting that. What is being suggested is that the SQA signed off a moderation system which was largely based on historic past performance by the centres, in the sure and certain knowledge that that would mean that pupils in those schools with a poorer past performance would be more heavily impacted. Is that fair? I think the answer is yes.
No, I wouldn't accept. My hesitation is because I wouldn't quite accept that characterisation. But I think it's important that I answer that question honestly, and that I have the opportunity to do so. The moderation process was based on data, and it was right that it was based on data. It was the evidence that we had, and I would accept, again, that the extraordinary circumstances of the year meant that we were awarding on a basis that I think we would all accept was not ideal because of the cancellation of exams, and was certainly unprecedented. But I think we sought to ensure a process which would not bind centres into historic performance entirely, albeit that in the absence of historic attainment and the pattern of attainment, it would have been very difficult to do any moderation at all. And indeed, it's a process that has been undertaken by other parts of the UK in the awarding decisions this year. But I think the work that we did around the equalities impact assessment highlighted that there was a narrowing of the gap between the least and most deprived. Now, I would accept that the estimates highlighted very significant differences between historic attainment and estimates for this year, and increasingly so across the deciles of deprivation. But what I would say there is that's a function of the estimates. It's a function of the estimates, and the outcome that we achieved was to ensure that, the outcome that we saw showed a narrowing of the attainment gap, a modest one, but a narrowing of the attainment gap.
The outcome that we saw showed that young people in schools in more deprived communities were twice as likely to have their grades reduced as those in better off communities. That surely was the thing that we saw, and it was a function of a moderation scheme which took account of historic performance in the centre, and we discussed that previously at committee. But let me move on, because part of that defence, and part of the defence that we heard from the Deputy First Minister yesterday, was that moderation takes place every year. Okay? And you said in your opening remarks, Ms Robertson, if you accept moderation, you have to look at historic attainment by centre. But these things are not entirely true, are they? Moderation takes place every year on a national level, and what happens is that grade boundaries and different subjects shift, and that's sometimes controversial. We see, oh, maths is pass mark of 34% is disgraceful. But the difference is those grade boundaries are applied consistently to young people who sit those exams wherever they sat them and wherever they went to school. That's the difference this year, isn't it? I mean, you'll be aware of the paper, I'm sure, by Professor Nason from Imperial College, in which he makes the analogy with the driving test. He says, if you take a driving test in the UK, it is a national test set to national standard. Your results should not depend on what has been happening in your local town. And he points out that the exams in each of the devolved nations are meant to be national exams. So they should be moderated at a national level, not moderated at a local level against historic past performance. Isn't it the case that we don't do that every year? We have only done it this year, and that's why we've seen what's happened this year.
You're right, we don't do it. We have not done it any other year because we have had we've had young people have been able to sit exams, and they've been assessed in their own right in that way. I think that the difference this year was what moderation sought to do. And I think you would be right in your characterisation if you assumed that every school in Scotland had estimated, or a school and college in Scotland had consistent estimation. An estimation that perhaps could...
So the problem here is that the SQA couldn't trust the estimations which were made by teachers.
Well,
they were moderating teachers, not the pupils.
No, I don't accept that. I mean, as I've highlighted, without teacher estimates, we couldn't have certificated. We accepted almost 3/4 of those estimates. What we felt we had a responsibility to do was to ensure that estimation practice across schools was, as far as we could, consistent, and that therefore, you know, given the point that you've made, that your result actually wouldn't be judged by the school that you went to in their estimation process. It would be judged on the basis of the data that we had available to us, including historic data. And I realise that's quite a subtle argument, but it's quite an important one, because some schools, in principle, some schools could have estimated very significantly over or under previous experience, and albeit that there are some changes in attainment year on year, it's a fairly stable system overall, a fairly stable system. If I had seen a school that had estimated in a particular subject in excess of, say, 20 or 30 points below or indeed above previous years, would it be, you know, there's an issue of fairness there too. So I think what we sought to do was to look at centres before we made national awarding decisions. If we'd simply made national awarding decisions, I think I may have been sitting here today with you suggesting that there was an unfairness to that because schools had estimated in a different fashion. So that was part of the reason that we undertook the moderation that we did.
Well, I don't think you should make, you know, hypothetical assumptions about what complaint we might make, but I think if I was a teacher, still a teacher hypothetically, I would feel that it was my estimates that had been moderated, and that was what the SQA were doing. Could I ask, I've got two more, is that okay? Very,
and I'll bring you back in at the end if I can.
All right, well, let me ask this one more and I'll come back in on the other one later on. I'm quite intrigued by the timeline that you've kind of outlined, although it's fairly sparse. I've tried to note it down as you go along, and I have really only 2 dates in the timeline. One is March the 19th, when exams were cancelled and the Deputy First Minister commissioned you to produce a moderation scheme on the basis, or an alternative award scheme on the basis that you've described. And the 30th of July, when you provided the Deputy First Minister with a report including the overall results and so on. And I've got two questions about that. The first is, in between these dates, when did you actually sign off the moderation scheme, and when did you begin moderating the results? And my second question is, between March the 19th and the 30th of July, are you saying to the committee that the SQA had no contact, direct or indirect, with the Deputy First Minister or his office or his special advisors to find out how this process was going, whether everything was going to be in place and what was happening? Was there any contact at all?
So the first question was around signing off the moderation scheme. I think there were, I can provide, if it would be helpful to follow up in writing, I can do that, because there were various stages to that process, and I think I described when I appeared before the committee on the 1st of May that we had a situation where there was a degree of iteration here, but an appropriate degree of iteration, because we obviously did quite a lot of work before estimates came in, but we needed to look at those estimates, and we needed to consider them. So there was a process of iteration, but I think it's fair to say we were working on this well into July, as we finalised our approach and undertook our national awarding meetings. In relation to discussions with ministers, I mean, I have ongoing engagement with ministers and indeed Scottish Government officials, as you would in the normal way, but there were really no detailed discussions beyond a general discussion about how things were going in terms of the work that we were doing. Mr Swinney did join staff in a discussion, I think in the middle of June, to hear about some of the process issues that we were undertaking. As I say, and as he said yesterday, on the 30th of July, I presented him with the outcome of the approach. And I think it is important. I think it was in relation to Mr Green's questions earlier on. I think it is really important to highlight that it is, given the operational independence of the SQA, it was very important that there was that separation between the SQA and ministers in this context, because while the Deputy First Minister has an interest in what we do, he, well, until yesterday, has not had a role in awarding decisions or taking any decisions in relation to awarding decisions. So it's really important that the committee understands that the responsibility for the certification model that was presented last week was the SQA's. Now, as I also said to Jamie Green, the board is appointed by ministers and is accountable to ministers, and obviously the board were very, very close to the work that we were doing and had lots of discussions about that. So that's effectively how the accountability arrangement works.
Quite hard to believe you had a discussion with the staff group on the process of this most important moderation in the history of exams without any of the issues we've been pursuing today coming up.
We did not discuss the outcome. We did not discuss the estimates that had been received, or any at that point. It wouldn't.
Well, no, that's not what I mean. I mean the generalities of the moderation scheme.
I mean, Jill, you might want to say a little bit more about that. I think we discussed in broad terms with a number of colleagues just some of the work that we'd done in quite short order, actually, to stand up new processes, to talk through the work that we were doing. But I don't think it would constitute anything beyond a discussion with staff, just to hear more about how we were getting on, which I would consider to be appropriate. We did not get into any areas of detail or intervention that would be inappropriate.
Johnson to be followed by Alec Neil.
Thank you very much. Hopefully my questions can lead to some short answers, because they're mainly kind of factual. On the 30th of July, you said you gave a briefing to the Deputy First Minister. Can I ask, did that briefing include, or was that the full data available to the Deputy First Minister from the 30th of July, including the information which would have highlighted some of the issues that became so prominent? Did you raise any concerns with the Deputy First Minister over the impact of the results coming out, and did he raise any concerns with you?
So on the 30th of July, we share the data with the Scottish. We share the data with the Scottish Government, and that happens every year.
All of the data, including the as it would be presented when the results come out.
We share the outcomes with the Scottish Government officials as part of pre-release arrangements, which is not unusual with statistics of this kind. So we were sharing the outcomes of that process, so not the detail of the process. So effectively the attainment statistics that were published last Tuesday were shared with Scottish Government officials on the Thursday before results day. In addition, I myself took Mr Swinney alongside the chair of the board and Mr Swinney and a supporting official through the approach that we had taken, and that was effectively a presentation. I ran through the detail of what we had done and the impact of that, and it was a wide-ranging discussion, as you would expect.
So can I just clarify the downgrading of grades for schools in more deprived areas would have been available and clear to the Deputy First Minister on the 30th of July from the information that was provided to his office? We
highlighted, I mean, the focus was very much on the outcomes which included equality considerations as part of that process. Okay. But we did not, I think it's important for me to highlight that we did not take him through the full detail of all the documentation.
But it would have been available to his office?
No, not on the 30th of July, not
Okay.
all the documentation, no. As I say, I took him through the headlines of the work that we were doing in some detail, but the documentation was not, the full documentation was not provided to the Scottish Government at that time.
Okay. And were there any concerns raised by him in terms of the outcomes? Or is there anything that you highlighted with him that could be?
I took him through the detail of that discussion, and that was the purpose of that discussion. And we had it was a fulsome conversation, as you would expect. In that context.
Okay, it's quite important to know how, given that there was this U-turn that happened a number of days after the results came out, it'd be interesting to know exactly what was known and how much time there was for a decision to be turned round. Can I just go on just to ask about the change that has happened?
Yeah.
You've talked obviously about the accuracy of teacher estimates, which you said I think was below 50% or around that mark anyway, and obviously protecting standards and looking to having responsibility for students past and future. The Deputy First Minister and the First Minister have both said that the changes that they've eventually been made would have been not credible before they actually made them. Can you tell me, are you comfortable with the Deputy First Minister's decision that he's taken to go purely with teacher estimates? Were you consulted, and did you raise any concerns if you were consulted? And also, do you think there will be issues, or do you think standards have been maintained given the decision that has been taken?
I think the Deputy First Minister in his statement yesterday set out the reasons for taking the decision that he did, and I understand that decision, and ministers have issued a ministerial direction to me to ensure that that I will fully comply with. As part of the Education Scotland 1996 Act, we are required to be consulted on the ministerial direction, and that consultation, both formally and informally, did happen. So, of course, there was a discussion about this decision.
Can you tell us what your response to that consultation was?
Well, there was obviously some discussion about the terms of the ministerial direction in the normal way. So I think the issue there in terms of the outcome that we have. I mean, and I think both the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister have expressed this, is this reflects the extraordinary nature of the year. And on that basis, I think it's very important. I think it is very important that young people who do receive awards this year do feel that they have achieved the awards that they have.
I absolutely accept that.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the position at the beginning of the week. The position at the beginning of the week was that it was not credible. Your position that you've made here is that you needed to maintain standards and there would be an issue. There has now been a volte-face, there's a complete turnaround on that. Are you comfortable that standards will be maintained given the decision that has been taken?
Two things in response to that. One is that my expression of the work that we've done has been on the basis that we were asked to undertake this task, and as part of that commission, that standards were maintained, and that's what I sought to do. So I think that's quite an important part of why we did what we did.
And have they been maintained?
I think what the Deputy First Minister expressed yesterday is this will be treated as an exceptional year. I think it will be very difficult.
I'm getting the suggestion that you're not comfortable saying that, because you're telling me what the Deputy First Minister's said already, and we've, as I say, we've had two positions from him. Is your position constant or consistent that you have concerns over whether standards for the future will be maintained?
I don't think we will be able to compare this year's results to previous year's results or future results in the same way, because the basis on which the basis on which the awards have been made is different. But there's an important caveat to that, which is, you know, our focus and attention, quite rightly, should be on young people who got the awards. We have accepted the teacher judgments. That's been a ministerial decision, and I accept that ministerial decision, and we will fully comply with it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Going to move on to Mr Neil to be followed by Ms Mackay. Mr Neil, sorry.
Hi. Thank you, Convener. Can I begin, Fiona, by highlighting the human cost of the episodes from last week? I had a call on Friday from a mother whose daughter, since the age of 5, in her words, has worked her guts out because she lives in a deprived area, and the whole family believe very firmly the way out of deprivation is through education. Her daughter was expected to go to college. She was anticipating a confirmation of the teacher's recommendation on the grades, but she didn't get them on Tuesday. By Friday, she hadn't come out of her room for 3 days. She hadn't eaten for 3 days, and she was in a total state of distraught. Now, the human impact of this whole episode, I think, will be with us for some time to come. I very much welcome the First Minister's statement yesterday. But what has worried me so far about this session this morning is I'm not getting the impression that the SQA has learned any lessons, in particular following up on the point Ian Gray made, you know, about the introduction of these local and using schools records as a factor, local schools records as a factor in deciding individual pupils' results. So can I get a guarantee from you that if we end up in a situation where we have to go through a similar process next year because we are still not in a position to have exams, would you change this system?
And the piece around the human cost, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that obviously very significant human cost arising from the events that we've all experienced over the last few months. So I understand that, and I also understand. We will all remember the feeling of the certificate dropping through the door and how that feels as a young person, and you know, and I'm also a parent, so I do understand the point that you're making very powerfully. But I think it's also important to say that I think, as I already have, joy and disappointment is a feature of Results Day. There were very unique differences this year which served to magnify the sense of disappointment, and I fully appreciate and understand that. In terms of learning lessons, of course, Many parts of the public sector will wish to learn lessons from the work that it's had to do over the last few months, and the SQA is no exception to that, and it's very important that I say that to the committee. You know, schools were closed a matter of weeks before exams were due to be held. We were fully ready for that process, and while of course we have contingency arrangements in place, I think all members of the committee, I hope, would accept that it would have been very difficult to fully predict the circumstances that we found ourselves in. And I can assure you that we worked very hard to deliver for learners this year. But on lessons learned, there is now a formal process around that, which has been initiated by the Deputy First Minister, that Mark Priestley at Stirling University will undertake some work. And we will cooperate fully and positively with that process. And if there are lessons to be learned, we will learn them. I've been SQA Chief Executive for a year. There are always things to do. There are always improvements to make in any organisation. But I think it's also really important that I say to the committee that, and I can say this genuinely and sincerely, that we have worked very hard to deliver on a commission from the Scottish Government this year. And we did our best to do that. In terms of the process for next year, Mark Priestley's review, which will be concluded within 5 weeks, will inform that process, and we will make sure that that absolutely we learn from this process in moving forward in what could be a complicated further year. But we remain on track for exams next year. That is the conclusion of the Education Recovery Group chaired by the Deputy First Minister, and we're putting in place some additional arrangements to help teachers and young people maximise learning and teaching time, and ensure that we have contingency arrangements in place for a variety of circumstances this coming year.
Well, that's good to hear, but you can understand the concern, because when you met the committee on the 1st of May, I think almost every member of the committee warned then that to develop a methodology in secret without proper and fairly wide consultation, understanding such a consultation would need to be very quick, would end in tears. And we told you that. And you know, the SQA absolutely refused to listen to the committee's point about the need to consult on the methodology before it was approved. And Ian Gray is right. I think everybody in their granny knew that if you did use the record of local schools, you would end up with the situation we ended up with, where the moderation process led to 2.5 times the downgrades in the poorest areas that actually happened in the more affluent areas. That was built into the methodology from day one. It was entirely predictable, and therefore the SQA, I mean, Larry Flanagan's in today's Herald, the leader of the EIS, saying the tarnished SQA should have heeded warnings and needed to lose some of its hubris. I have to say, I don't always agree with Larry Flanagan, but I have some sympathy with the point he's making. Do you not think one of the lessons you need to learn as an organisation is you need to listen not just to this committee, but particularly you need to listen to pupils, parents and teachers much more than you have done in relation to this exercise?
I think it's very important that we're a listening organisation. I think I highlighted in my correspondence to the committee the reasons why we did not publish the methodology until results day, and the Deputy First Minister spoke about that as well yesterday. I think it has been a very challenging year for everyone. I think the whole notion of moderation full stop was always going to be challenging, because there are two parts to the story. Does the system and does the committee accept that moderation should have been done at all? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the method of doing that? I certainly made clear, really right way back at the beginning of this process, that we needed to reserve the right to moderate, actually to ensure fairness for learners, given the issues, potential issues with estimation that I highlighted to you earlier, including the knowledge of that in informing the approach that we took. And it was on that basis that we took that process forward in good faith. So you know, I think the context here is actually quite important. But I understand the point you're making. I think we spent a lot of time over the last few months speaking to teachers. We have teachers working in our organisation and also engagement with young people and others. But if some parts of the system feel that that wasn't enough, then we need to hear that, and we need to learn from that.
Mr. Neil.
So my final question then is, the issue I don't think is the principle of moderation. I think it was the devil was in the detail, and as Ian Gray highlighted, if you agree to rely so heavily on the fairly recent results in individual schools, you were bound to end up with an unfair situation where people in the poorest section poorest areas had their downgrades of 2.5 times the rate of those in the most affluent areas. So my point is this: will you in future undertake, and I don't want sort of civil service flannel, will you give an undertaking in future that we will get these things done out in the open, properly discussed, properly consulted upon, not just the principle, but actually the mechanics, the logarithms of how these things are going to be done? At the end of the day, the SQA is charged with making the final decision on what it's going to use in terms of the methodology. But in this day and age, surely it cannot be done in secrecy ever again.
I think I understand what you're saying. I think though it's important, we don't, without meaning to sound flippant, we don't publish our marking instructions before the exam's been sat. So I think, and the statistics regulator has highlighted the need for, the UK statistics regulators highlighted the need for exam regulators and awarding bodies to think carefully about the amount of information that they publish before results day. No other part of the UK has published its full approach in anticipation of results day, although I acknowledge that some material has been made available. I think it's fair to say that the approach that we took, that we set out the parameters of that approach, and you're absolutely right, we did not publish the detail of that approach. But as I highlighted to you, we had in place a range of processes to ensure that we got to a position of being able to award on the 4th of August, and there were limits in what we could publish before then. But of course, as part of Professor Priestley's review, as part of the work that we're doing to prepare for 2021, we will consider those issues, and you have my assurance on that.
Ms Mackay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Robertson, you said today that you treated teachers' judgment with the utmost respect and that historic attainment was made by course for each school. A school in my constituency contacted me with a pretty startling statistic. One department showed A passes at 64% for the past 3 consecutive years in a subject, but their moderated grade was 24%. Passes at D grade increased from an average of 1% to 27% this year, an astonishing 27-fold increase in the lowest grade, and that teacher planned to appeal for 76% of his students. I'm not a statistician, but something tells me that that's a system that's not working correctly. You said that you regretted that that young people were upset, and I just want to know, and in a way it follows on from my colleague Alec Neil's question, if you think that the system you implemented actually worked and achieved fair results for young people, and were you surprised at the anomalies, given the fallout, were you surprised at the fallout from the system? And God forbid, we're ever in this situation again, would you use the same methodology?
So, in terms of the outcomes, I think we tried very hard to understand and consider the estimates that came in, both across schools and nationally, and what that meant. And it was therefore and we worked really hard, and I'm looking at Jill here because she was leading this leading the technical work around this process as part of the moderation, to understand the impact on individual centres and individual courses. And I think for the most part that was achieved. I think there are some anomalies, and the anomalies in part reflect the estimation process from schools and the shape of those estimates across, without seeking to again give a technical answer, the shape of those estimates across the bandings, which can impact on the kind of example that you've given, the volatility of a centre's attainment or not, or indeed stability, and the issues in some cases in relation to the starting point distributions for a subject. So I think it's fair to say that there are some anomalies that have been thrown up, but I think it's also important that I say that this was a four-stage process, and I think we recognise, and I would like to think we recognise this importantly in the appeals process that we put in place, because we recognise that there would be circumstances, given the moderation process that we really had to undertake, which couldn't be individualised for all the reasons that I've given, because we didn't have material in front of us in relation to individual candidate beyond the teacher estimate, that there may be circumstances where schools and colleges would want to appeal, and the evidence base for that process was really important. So that was literally looking at all the work that young people had done during the year. But it's important that I highlight that end-to-end process, because if you look at last Tuesday in isolation and accept that the upset that's been caused, it doesn't fully reflect the process that we designed across the year.
I mean, I have to say, I'm really struggling to understand how a statistic could go from 64% to 24%, and no matter what you say, I just don't think you've explained how anomalies like that could occur. Can I maybe just ask one quick final question? You said that you've taken a child-centred approach to this. The Children and Young People's Commissioner has said that's not the case, that there was no engagement when it came to the alternative grading process. I wonder if you could maybe tell us what engagement you actually did have.
So we produced a child rights and impact, child rights and wellbeing impact assessment, and we had engagement, including a discussion with young people, and as part of the Commissioner's work. There wasn't detailed engagement on the precise model with young people, but we have had engagement with young people, the Scottish Youth Parliament, a number of groups of young people throughout the process, to reflect on the circumstances of this year and the work that we've done. We also brought young people into the qualifications committee as well, to ensure that we were that they were mindful of that. And in our appeals process, we made sure that there was an opportunity for exceptional consideration arrangements in place to tackle any issues around the original estimation by centres, and that obviously requires learner consent as well. But I think the child rights and impact wellbeing impact assessment highlights the approach that we took. And I'm happy to have further discussions with the Commissioner's Office. I understand the Commissioner's Office has recently written to me and has made some comment on the back of Mr Swinney's discussion. If there are further things that we can do, particularly in the year ahead, to make sure that there's a greater and even greater focus around the engagement of young people in any processes and procedures that we need to put in place, and we're very happy to do that. Because I am really clear that what we're about is delivering for learners. I mean, that absolutely is the heart and soul of the organisation. Jill might want to come in on a point of detail on that, if that's okay.
Very quickly.
No, I'm done. No, I'm done.
You're fine. Thanks.
One more point. We are going to, later this week, carry out a rapid consultation on modifications to courses for the coming session. And part of that work will be to run focus groups with young people around the kind of principles of what we are doing, so that we can take their views into account. Obviously, yet again, as in everything COVID related, we have a very short time window to do that, but we have taken that on board, and we will be engaging through focus groups with young people.
So if I could ask a final question on this topic, and we do have a couple of areas that other members want to come on before we finish today, but in terms of I think what the committee and what the wider public want to be assured of is that there hasn't been a bias of inequality in the processes of the SQA either historically or in this instance. So one of the things that's been mentioned in your previous session and this one was that you had an understanding of how good or not centres were at estimating results. Given that this process, the estimation, became crucial to the whole process, can I ask what the SQA have done in the past to address issues of estimation with centres and whether they've engaged Education Scotland in that process?
So, Jill may want to provide some further detail, but on issues of estimation themselves, estimates are provided each year and form part of the grade boundary process, in particular around cohort, looking at a cohort for a particular subject in any year, which can vary year on year due to entry patterns and other reasons. So the estimates are a part of the process, but they're not fundamental to awarding. Would that be fair, Jill?
Yes, they have taken on an additional kind of prominent role this year, and we were very aware of that when we were commissioned to do this work to develop an alternative certification model based around teachers' estimates, which is why we put a lot of work into developing additional guidance for teachers and lecturers around estimation. We developed an online learning academy package for teachers as well, covering aspects of kind of conscious or unconscious bias and just raising their awareness around some of that and exemplifying. We also provided each centre with their historic 3 years of data on their historic estimates matched to the results that young people actually achieved through their exams and coursework, and we advised them to be using this on a kind of departmental level to look at their previous historic estimation practice to see if there was any, do they get it just about right, or is there a tendency within a department to underestimate or overestimate? So that was what we provided in order to help teachers, because we knew that estimates were the kind of fundamental part of the alternative certification model. And we saw that in that when we look at the outcomes of the moderation process, if less than 50% were accurate in previous years, what the moderation process has shown that about 75% were accurate. So there has been an enhancement to the estimation accuracy through this process, given that teachers and lecturers would know the central role that it played in awarding this year.
So you content knowing that there was a less than 50% accuracy previously in estimations, that became the core and most important part of what the system would be this year for awarding grades?
I think in the absence of coursework, which became very evident shortly after lockdown, I think it was right that estimates were the core part of the approach, and what we sought to do was to provide additional guidance and material to schools to assist them with that. So I think the integrity, if you like, of using teacher estimates for the work that we did this year was right, and indeed it's an approach that's been taken in every other part of the UK in the absence of performance, in the absence of exam performance data. So I think it was right, and I think we put quite a lot of effort into seeking to work with teachers to improve that, because it had a different status, if you like. It had a different status this year. I mean, in relation to the second part of your question about Education Scotland, I mean, Education Scotland have done quite a lot of work, in particular in the context of the development of standardised assessments in Scotland at P1, P3, P7 and S3. So that work's been an important part of their approach, and we have regular discussions with Education Scotland on some of these issues. We've also, importantly, delivered a lot of events and around standards and etc., so that teachers do understand the context and for our qualifications, and that's been another aspect. But absolutely, estimation has not been perfect in the past, but it's very hard for it to be so. What we did was we ensured that we were doing as much as we could to assist teachers in that process, and indeed teachers themselves, schools and colleges themselves, had moderation processes in place when they were looking across their different courses, and that was again a key feature of this process.
We are so tight of time, but there are a few other areas the committee would like to investigate. I'm going to bring in Mr. Greer first of all.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Robertson, could you confirm whether by the conclusion of the process, so not necessarily by August the 4th when the results were released, but certainly by the point where you had finalised the results and were able to share them with the Deputy First Minister, if by that point you had satisfied the concerns of the Equality and Human Rights Commissioner? That's been a line of questioning the committee had pursued previously.
So had we satisfied the Equality and Human Rights Commission?
The committee became aware that the EHRC had become involved in the process, had expressed concerns to yourself. Were those concerns all resolved?
To my knowledge, yes. There were. I think there's been I haven't been involved personally in all of those discussions, certainly, but there's been a lot of discussions with EHRC in relation to the Equalities Impact Assessment, and that process has been taken forward by my colleagues in parallel with the development of this work. So, yes.
Right, I think that may be an area where we'll discuss this later on as a committee. It may be an area where we ask for a bit more information in writing.
Happy to do that. I mean, as
it was never, and I understand why, but it was never entirely clear to the committee what the concerns were and how they were being resolved. So perhaps if that could be.
I mean, I think the initial issue was the fact that we had not published an EQIA, and I think as I expressed to the committee, we took the view that the Equality Impact Assessment should reflect the end-to-end process. But we've had some very productive discussions with the EHRC, and I know that they wrote to you as part of the evidence for this session, and I hope, and because I know that you've focused very keenly on the Equalities Impact Assessment, I hope that the material that we provided last week demonstrated that we had worked hard to meet our obligations, both in the letter and the spirit of those obligations, to make sure that we'd worked hard to consider those issues. There is some further analysis to do. EQIs are living documents, and we were able to undertake some analysis in relation to 2019 in relation to protected characteristics. That information is held by the Scottish Government, and there'll need to be some further work done on that. So I would acknowledge that it's not complete in that sense, but I think the Commission were absolutely the Commission will have been aware of that in the discussions that we've been having.
And I've got one specific question around this combination of what was included in the EQIA and the methodology report in relation to rankings. It had been raised previously, the committee had raised that obviously the use of a ranking system can bring it the danger of unconscious bias. Resources were produced for teachers to tackle that. The concerns that have been raised with me are about how the rankings were used in relation to the estimated grades. If I'm reading the combination of the EQIA and the methodology report correctly, the rankings were not in the end used as absolute individual rankings, but essentially as groups by those refined grade bands. The concern that's been raised with me is that those 19 groupings were used almost as an absolute, that their infallibility wasn't really brought into doubt in the process in the way that teacher estimates were. So there were situations where a teacher may have estimated an A for a pupil, but it was decided to award them a C. Where that teacher had put the pupil in the refined ranking didn't really seem to be in doubt, because obviously the SQA were not adjusting those rankings. You weren't moving pupils from group
that's right.
to group. So I have a lot of teachers who have essentially said to me, and there's one example that summarises it best, where a teacher got in touch, I think about 90 kids in their cohort, said, my top 10 in the rankings, their grades were all left alone. Everyone beneath the top 10 was moved down one grade. Their concern was that their professional judgment in issuing an estimated grade was brought into far more doubt despite the huge amount of work they had put into it, whereas where they had put the pupils in the ranking was just assumed to be correct. And how those two actually married up in the methodology concern people. If a teacher's estimated grade can be brought into so much doubt that it's moved 2, or in a very small number of cases, even 3 grading points, how does that marry up with a ranking system that didn't seem to doubt where the which refined grade group the teacher had put the young person in?
Yeah. I think I understand the point you're making, because you're absolutely right that we viewed rank order as sacrosanct. So we didn't, if we moved, for example, some young people from an A to a B, it wouldn't necessarily be the case that we'd move all young people, all the Bs to Cs, etc. But there absolutely was. I mean, it's described in the report as the waterfall effect. Although it's important that we were also, pushing water up the hill in some cases as well. So we absolutely did treat the rank order as sacrosanct. But we know, I mean, that there's, and Jill would be able to say a little bit more about this, but the literature relating to teacher estimates actually highlights that rank order has quite a lot of integrity, that in many respects, teachers are able to differentiate in that way, in some cases more easily than they might be able to identify the correct grade. So there is some evidence around this, and I suppose the issue there for us was, on what basis would we interrupt the rank order? So I think that would have raised perhaps different issues, genuinely different issues of substance that would have been subject to questioning as well. So absolutely, there are some judgments here, but we felt that the rank order from teachers needed to be held, and that didn't mean that everyone moved grades if some moved from an A to a B, but it did mean that the rank order was treated as quite an important element. I mean, Jill might want to say a little bit on the research evidence if you're interested, because I think there's an important piece here around how we judge the, I guess, relative performance of young people. And I think what we sought to do, I understand the point you're making about bias, what we really sought to try and ensure that teachers were aware of their responsibilities there, and indeed made sure that a number of colleagues were involved in any decisions around estimation, so that it wasn't just perhaps one teacher, but it was groups of teachers, and that there was some moderation at a local level. Jill?
The research evidence does back that up at a kind of UK level. It's the teachers and lecturers, the research evidence tells us from studies that are done, are very good at relative rankings of their individual pupils, about how one person is doing relative to another, and they're perhaps slightly less accurate in terms of making what they call an absolute judgment, which is placing an individual candidate on an individual grade, on an individual band, on a kind of national scale. And indeed, that's what the national data says from other UK awarding bodies, and it's also what SQA's historic data tells us as well when we compare estimates to the actual grades achieved in the examinations. So it was that piece of kind of research that we relied on for that judgment about, rank orders should be sacrosanct because teachers, the evidence tells us that they are good at making those relative judgments. So that's why we preserved them. And indeed, we had lots of dialogue with our colleagues in the other parts of the UK about some of these kind of matters, in particular of qual. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got one question about appeals, convener, but I'm aware that others probably want to come in.
There are quite a few, in fairness to other members, that do want to come in as well. And unfortunately, I think we have to draw things to a close at that point. But there are areas around appeals and the exam diet in 2021 that the committee were keen to get to. And just to put on note that we will probably be looking to have a conversation with SQA in the future regards to those areas. Can I thank both Ms Robertson and Dr Stewart for their attendance at committee this morning, and I think I would like to put on record that this has been the most difficult of circumstances, and to be an employee of the SQA at this time in the last week could not have been an easy situation for any of the employees to be in, and just to note that you know, the SQA have been working under the same pressures as everyone else during the COVID crisis. Before drawing committee into private session today, I'd like to also thank and put on record our thanks to Ros Thompson, who moves on from the committee today to a new committee, and we thank her for all her support to the committee in her tenure as the Chief Clerk to Education and Skills Committee. I'm now going to move into private session, and thank you once again for your attendance today.